Hey, you guys, this is Professor Vitt, and welcome to our lecture on conspiracy theories, our discussion on conspiracy theories. Um, let's get going. What is a conspiracy theory anyway? There are different examples, there are different versions, but very, very roughly, like an example might be something like, there are aliens and the US government is hiding them. There's some group of advanced super leaders or humans, the Illuminati, who are sort of controlling the fate of the human race. They're genetically engineering bees in order to XYZ or something like that. They're perhaps putting fluoride in water in order to make people more docile or something like that. And then, of course, 9/11. I think the intention here is to refer to 9/11 with that particular plane, but I don't know. It's just a graphic. So any of these might be considered conspiracy theories, and some of you may be inclined to sort of laugh off these ideas before they get off the ground. But remember, in critical thinking, it's really important to evaluate an idea on the merits. We have to do that. You can't just dismiss an idea outright. So roughly, conspiracy theories are usually theories about the world where knowledge is restricted by some powerful forces and they've committed some kind of cover up. There's always a great deal of secrecy involved. The implications of these theories are always very, very significant for either the nature of reality or our social order, or how we're being manipulated. And most of the time, most of the people who are outside of this conspiracy theory are totally unaware that it exists. They're just sheeple walking through the world, totally unaware that something like reptoids are infiltrating our society or have infiltrated our society. Probably this is largely a modern invention, and like everything else, it's fueled by the internet. I think I might remove that bit. Everything's fueled by the internet, right? Okay. Before we get into some particulars, there are some very bizarre examples I want to give to you. Here's an example of a news clipping from something called the Tuskegee experiment, which was actually a true story. It's an awful story, but it's important for us that we just at least cover it. The U.S. government made a sort of systematic study of 400 mostly poor, illiterate black males in the South, and they studied the progression of syphilis in these individuals. Now, they didn't treat it, even though that was pretty easy to do with penicillin at the time, and they wanted to discover, I think the idea was something like whether or not ethnicity had anything to do with the progression of syphilis. I mean, just crazy stuff, right? Awful, awful, awful thing that the government has done, but it actually happened, right? It actually did occur. Here's another one. I have a little Illuminati hand hostile takeover for this next true story. This was a kind of a conspiracy theory that turned out to be true, just like the Tuskegee experiment did. In 1933, a group of really wealthy businessmen that included the heads of different corporations tried to recruit the Marine Corps general, Major General Smedley Butler, what a name, to lead a military coup against Franklin Delano Roosevelt and install a fascist dictatorship in the United States because they thought that would be better for their business interests. Now, we know this because Butler testified to it in front of Congress. The committee, I think, found the allegations credible, but nobody was ever prosecuted by it. Now, that's the real deal conspiracy theory, right? Here's another crazy one, MK Ultra. Some of you may have heard of this. The government studied the effects of mind control and drugs on unsuspecting victims, I guess I'd call them. Someone was given LSD for 174 days straight. People were given barbiturates and heroin and morphine and MDMA and all kinds of stuff, right? Just to see what would happen and whether or not they could develop techniques for mind control. This is an awful thing. I mean, there's just no sense in which any of these events are okay. They all are very unsettling. They go against our social norms and our social order. So the first thing I think it's healthy to remember is that, some of these crazy claims about maybe what the government is doing and stuff, you can't dismiss it offhand. I mean, the government is capable of awful things. Most governments are probably capable of doing awful things to their people and so forth. You can have total distrust of the regime. You can be convinced that they don't have your interests at heart in any sense of the word, and you can still not maintain conspiracy theory. So just keep in mind that you don't have to accept a conspiracy theory because you don't like the government or you don't like its policies or you think it's malicious. And if you want to talk about approach to regimes and morality and rulers and so forth, we can do that in political philosophy, and I'm very interested in that topic, so that's a great thing to talk about. But don't feel like because you distrust the government, you automatically fall into the basket of being a conspiracy theorist. There's a psychological component to conspiracy theories. We will not cover that stuff here. There is some data on this, but I think it's somewhat speculative anyway. There's some marked measure of paranoia. Some metrics that measure this stuff apparently are increased in proponents of conspiracy theories. They have a tendency to fear a lack of control. Random events can be frightening to all of us, right? Whether it's landing on the moon or someone killing our president or slaughtering civilians. I mean, these things are almost essentially, by definition, a lack of control of the social order. And perhaps there's also some desire for self-worth. I don't know. Some of that seems fairly subjective, but there may be some empirical data there. Again, it's sort of outside the scope of what we're doing. When we look at conspiracy theories, we're going to put our thinking cap. We're going to study three things. Okay, sorry about that. There's some clicking thing. Hold on a second. Okay, sorry. I heard my 3-year-old doing something, and I had to make sure that was okay. Three things you need to remember when you're approaching when you're approaching a conspiracy theory critically, right? You need to put on your thinking cap. There's a little thinking cap. You need to remember confirmation bias, agency or pattern detection, and proportioning belief to evidence. What does it mean? Well, let's start. Confirmation bias or motivated reasoning often manifests itself, or it's present when you see evidence for something everywhere. When in the context of a conspiracy theory, evidence against a conspiracy theory or evidence or absence of evidence for a conspiracy theory actually becomes evidence for a conspiracy theory. There's the fallacy of the spider web, and there's a cause correlation mistake. So we'll get to all that stuff. Agency and patternicity detection. This is just, we're really good at finding patterns and then also proportioning belief to the evidence. Okay, confirmation bias. This is way, way back. You guys probably remember the Wizard of Oz example, the glasses, one of the first things that we did. But really, confirmation bias in this context is people remembering the hits and they forget the misses, right? So when there's a coincidence, they latch onto it, and then when there is no other coincidence, they kind of lose they lose that. And I think this is pointed out pretty well if you think about the skeptoid example where Brian Dunning lists, I think it's Ann Lander's point actually. He says, look, there are all these amazing coincidences supposedly between Lincoln and Kennedy, but there are lots of things that aren't hits, right? They're different heights, they're different weights, they're born in different places, they have different sized clothing, blah, blah, blah. We just remember the hits, we don't remember the misses. Now, one instance of confirmation bias, I think, in some conspiracy theories is when there's a lack of evidence for that theory, the proponents of the theory actually turn that into positive evidence for the theory. So what do I mean? Okay. Roswell. We didn't cover this, but you probably know about it. If in 1947 in the New Mexico desert, supposedly there was an alien flying saucer that crashed in the desert. Now, there was lots and lots of speculation about this. Stanton Friedman was one of the first researchers to sort of blow it open, and this became probably the nexus for modern ufology. That there was an alien ship, it crashed in Roswell, we used it to develop our technologies further, blah 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 blah. Okay, in 1995 the Air Force issues a report where it explains what actually happened in the desert according to it, and it said, look, we had these super high altitude weather balloons. They were or I think they were surveillance balloons, maybe they were skyhooks, I don't know. And it was a classified project. It crashed, and so we used this cover story of aliens, right? So that explains, everything that we wanted to say about Roswell and the New Mexico desert. Fair enough. But then people began, how do I put this? People began looking at the Roswell report and saying, oh, no, this isn't evidence against the existence of extraterrestrials crashing. This is actually evidence for it. And they developed these sort of sophisticated and in some cases convoluted and mistaken arguments about this Roswell report and why they don't believe it and so on and so forth. So what you have there is almost a backfire effect. So let me give you another example. When you look at aerial photos of the area around New Mexico in 1947, the ground isn't disturbed in the way that is depicted by people who claim to have seen the crash. There's no crash. When that get pointed out to people, they say, well, that's because the government came in and cleaned up the crash and they resurfaced the desert and you could never tell. Well, at that point, you're stuck, right? Because now you're immune to revising your belief. You're no longer willing to say, well, there was no evidence of a crash. Instead, you're saying, no, there's evidence of a cover-up. But now the evidence for a cover-up is the same as the evidence of no cover-up. So you're stuck, right? So that's one worry. A second thing that you need to remember when you're looking at conspiracy theories is agency and patternicity, which is basically the tendency for us to see people or see agency and patterns in things where it's just random noise, right? So look at this example of this little snow falling on a tree. Looks like a little person. It's amazing, actually. You can kind of see the eyes and stuff and the nose and the little goatee, whatever you call that. It's a big beard. But that's just snow falling on a tree. Right here you see Godzilla, and a lot of people would look at that and say, oh, that's not Godzilla, that's just a tree. But it's actually Godzilla. No, I'm kidding. It's the opposite. Okay. And then, of course, a fry that looks like a ducky or a pigeon or bird or something. I don't know. But we're good at seeing patterns where there aren't necessarily ones. And that'll come up in conspiracy theories. Let me show you one involving Obama and the 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati. Now, if you look at this particular frame and you count the candles, and I don't even know if I can do it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13 candles, although that's a little fudgy in there. Behind the debt ceiling speech, 13 candles, 13 Illuminati bloodlines. Ta-da! Look at all this stuff here, right? So this is Lady Gaga. Boom, satanic pentagram. You see, just do the diagram. This is Madonna at a Super Bowl, and I think she's making an Illuminati gesture with her hands. Look at Nickelodeon, the eye, pyramid, Nickelodeon, controlled by the Illuminati. And here's one here, another Illuminati symbol, right, in a Simpsons episode. So the idea is you can see these patterns, in a lot of places, right? You can see triangles in a lot of places. You can even see triangles and eyes in a lot of places, but it doesn't mean that is then a message from the Illuminati. I've had friends who've done animation and graphics and so forth for these kinds of shows, nothing for Nickelodeon, and they say, oh, well, that just based on their experience, that doesn't make any sense at all. This is someone who's paid, or a team of people who are paid to generate these graphics. They wouldn't be thinking about that, but that's the issue, right? So there's a tendency for people sometimes to see a triangle or see a shape and immediately associate that with Illuminati, and that may be an example of patternicity. Here's an example of Washington, D.C., and if you look at the streets and you draw them a certain funny way, you get a pentagram. But if you actually look real closely, you notice that these aren't avenues here. These two things, this is an avenue, but then it stops. That's an avenue, and then it stops. And somebody says, well, that's the White House, and this is, well, it's a little subjective, right? Here's a better example. This is Ruth Chris Steakhouse in Arizona. There are 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you look, they're all laid out like a pentagram. Now, if you go to the exact center of the pentagram, it's a house on Golden Key Street. So right there by their pool, I don't know if that's where they do their business or what, but maybe that's an Illuminati house. I don't know. But it's presumably right there. So, okay, so that is an example of seeing patterns in things. If we stared long enough at this MapQuest, and we put in enough options, we would find other shapes. We would find parallelograms, and we would find all sorts of things. So you have to be aware that we have a tendency to see patterns in things. It doesn't mean that the patterns are not there, but it means that whether or not the patterns are there deliberately or not, we will find them. So keep that much in mind. Okay, then we have the spiderweb fallacy. And this is where someone constructs a web of associations, and these associations attempt to explain various events, or to explain some type of organizational hierarchy that perhaps the Illuminati or something has. Here's an example of Obama at a rally, giving some kind of victory or peace sign or a shock, I don't know. But this, of course, would be easily interpreted as Illuminati or the sign, the horns of the devil or something like that. Here's George Bush, and I think right after this picture, he actually said "hook 'em horns," because I think that's the Texas Longhorns thing, and that's what he's doing. But of course, why would you say that when you could just say it's Illuminati? Another place you can look for patterns quite fruitfully is the dollar bill. Here's just an example, 13 layers of brick, 13 original colonies, 72 bricks, 72 powers of the name of the god in Kabbalah, the date form 666, 13 arrows, 13 leaves, 13 berries, blah, blah, blah. Phoenix, not an eagle rising from the ashes, or ignorant world. I mean, all this stuff, right? You give me a theme and a dollar bill and I'll connect the dots, right? It doesn't mean we can dismiss this idea right out of hand, but it does mean that we're going to have a real good tendency to find patterns whether or not they exist. Okay. Let's talk briefly about the last. So we had confirmation bias, we had agency and pattern detection, and now we're going to talk about proportioning beliefs to the evidence. During the Sandy Hook massacre, very early on, CBS reported that there was a potential second shooter in custody and that SWAT was investigating the home of that suspect. Conspiracy theories for Sandy Hook usually revolve around something like this. And people say, look, we have this report, there was a second shooter, and it's all washed under the rug. Now, in order to appreciate how to evaluate a statement like this, let's look at a rule that we all use every day, and it's basically that a wise person proportions belief to the evidence. What does that mean? The greater the claim, the more extraordinary the claim, the more evidence you're going to need to prove that it's true. Suppose someone tells you this statement over here: Professor Vitt drove a Toyota Corolla to work. You wouldn't think much of it, right? If somebody says, do you believe it? You'd probably say, I guess. I mean, Toyota Corolla is a fairly normal type of car. he's a professor, not an attorney anymore. So well, I'm still an attorney, I'm not licensed, but maybe he's just decided to go with Corollas. It's a little more pedestrian. Yeah, I can see it fitting his personality. And then another person comments, yeah, I've seen him drive it too. And then you would believe it, right? You'd have a couple of people say, I've seen his car. It's a Corolla. It's a Toyota. Okay, wonderful. Notice that that's not a really crazy claim that I have a Toyota Corolla. There's nothing extraordinary about it. People have cars. Toyotas are cars. They're a fairly common type of car. Yeah, I can see him having a Corolla. Okay, but now suppose somebody told you, right, that Professor Vitt flew to work, that I actually started fluffing my hands and I lifted up into the sky and I flew from my home to Long Beach, which is probably like 50 miles away. Would you believe that for a second? No, you probably wouldn't, because it goes against a lot of what we know about reality. How much force would he have to generate with his hands in order to produce enough lift to get off the ground, and then how rapidly would he have to move his arms, and how much air resistance would have to be there, and how much food would he have to eat to keep that going, and structurally are his bones and muscles built to perform those kinds of tasks, etc., etc. And you'd say, no, that's a pretty crazy claim, I don't believe you. Right? But now suppose a second person says, no, I saw him fly to work too. I still don't think you'd believe him. You'd think, well, you're crazy, you're pulling a prank on me. It's more likely that you're pulling a prank than that he really did. And then you get 3 or 4 people who say, no, I actually saw it too. You still probably wouldn't believe it. And it might be the kind of thing where you said, you know what? I'm only going to believe it if I see it myself. Right? And that's a case where you have a really extraordinary claim, and so you're going to need more evidence to bolster it. So the bigger the claim, the more evidence you're going to need, and the better evidence you're going to need. How does this apply to conspiracy theories? Okay. There's a claim that there's a second shooter in custody in Sandy Hook, right? Very early report. Now that's an extraordinary claim, because of all the information that we have gathered about the crime since. All the witnesses that were there, all the physical evidence that was presented, absolutely everything that we know indicates that there was one shooter. And this report, as often happens in a crisis, was mistaken. Lots of misinformation comes out during, there's this big drive to get the scoop in journalism. And sometimes people move too quickly. And this is a case where that happened. It's pretty clear to see how that would work. That seems more likely to me. It's just one anecdote against the balance of everything else we know about Sandy Hook, right? But when you're a conspiracy theory, there's a tendency, a theorist, not always, but sometimes there's a tendency for them to sort of latch on to one anecdote that doesn't mesh with anything else that we know and fixate on that and say, no, that is on the same level as all the other physical evidence that we have. But it's not, So keep that in mind. Let me give you another example. This has to do with Roswell, which we talked about earlier. And the claim is that this gentleman named Philip Corso came forward and said, look, I know what happened at Roswell. We ceded alien technology to civilian industries, and that explains, all these things. So I think he claims that he helped, I think, Xerox machines and lasers and a couple of other things. But let's just focus on lasers. He claims that he took technology from an alien spaceship and then used it to distribute that technology to commercial industries. But actually, that's not right. Look, we know how the laser was produced. There's a really good record of people trying to make one. I mean, it goes back many years, and we know when the first one was made. And we know, right, you can look at their technical reports and their manuals and stuff like that as to how people were building toward this for years. Now, what's more convincing? All of this other evidence, which indicates the progression of technology, or an anecdote by someone who's making this extraordinary claim that there are aliens and he gave that technology to commercial industry. Well, it looks like if you focus on his anecdote and you fixate on it, then that's going to become your evidence. But you're going to do that at the cost of all the other evidence. So the idea is you need to, if someone's making an extraordinary claim, they're going to need more evidence to back it up. What evidence does Corso bring to back up his claim that he helped seed alien technology into United States commerce? None, right? It is purely anecdotal. He doesn't give names, dates, meetings, logs, notes, copies of what he distributed, nothing like that. It's just his claim. And so, you have to say, well, gosh, how strong, how much weight can I put on this evidence? It doesn't mean you can disregard it entirely, but it means you have to evaluate it according to everything else. Okay, a real quick recap. You're going to apply confirmation bias to the 9/11 theory. So keep these 3 points in mind. Number 1, confirmation bias. You remember the hits, you forget the misses. Look for that happening in 9/11 conspiracy theories. You may find it, you may not. Agency or pattern detection. Are people finding these amazing coincidences between, a leaseholder on one of the buildings being related to a Bush and George Bush being president or something like that? And then lastly, proportion belief to the evidence. Are early anecdotes that are presented the result of eyewitness accounts? Okay, fair enough. Do those eyewitness accounts square with the physical evidence? Remember, eyewitness accounts can be shaky. We learned that in part in Module 4, right, where we talked about, if you did the extra credit in Module 4, you might know that. Okay, that marks the end of this lecture. Remember, you're going to need these 3 things in order to apply them to the 9/11 theory, conspiracy theory, right after, oh my gosh, you guys, my son is crying. I've got to go.